Welcome back. I think everybody, well, most of you know and have experienced Ira before, so I won't go very long, but we're very privileged to have Ira back again this year, and he's going to be speaking on.
The name, the described name was a multi-layered approach to stopping ransomware, or something like that. This is just I didn't change the title slides, it's the same thing.
And I welcome Ira to the stage.
Thank you. Sorry, let's see, okay, I really don't have to. Okay, did everybody's, so let me start by telling a story, because I've told this story, ironically, I got this story from CornCon in 2017, I think. How many, did people see the stickers out there that say don't click on shit?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so I'm so happy, the 12-year-old has a don't click on shit sticker. Okay, I'm so happy, it doesn't matter, it's irrelevant. You're under 18, it makes me look like crap, okay? But anyway, so here's the thing. You have the stickers that say don't click on shit. And, you know, so what happened was, I think the first time I saw those stickers was in 2017 at CornCon or something like that. And what happened was I flew in that morning, and, you know, and so I always have to be here for lunch. So I was on the lunch buffet line, and there was like an admin type guy in front of me. And he's like walking along, hopefully he's not here now. But anyway, so the admin type guy in front of me, he sees these don't click on shit stickers on the table of the buffet line, and he's like, wow, I need a whole bunch of these. I got a whole bunch of users that keep clicking on shit. And my reaction was, you must give your users a lot of shit to click on. And he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, how are they gonna click on shit if you didn't give them all the shit to click on? And he's like, what? It's like, why are they I'm like, why are you giving it to them? And anyway, by the way, if they're gonna click on it, why don't you do anything to stop the results of it? And he was like, what do you mean by that? I'm like, he knew what I meant. But anyway, it's like a good story I've been telling for so long, and it's basically the same issue. Because if everybody's worried about the users clicking on shit, you're the people giving the users shit to click on. Why isn't that clicking in your head? You know, the problem is, and you know, my book is called You Can Stop Stupid, available at better bookstores everywhere, except for the fact I'm not a whore author to bring some with me. But anyway, get my book, it's good. But the problem is that everybody, it doesn't click in the IT professional's mind that if users are clicking on shit, they're getting that shit from somewhere that you're giving it to them. So you gotta start to remember, people clicking on ransomware, because again, multi-layer approach to ransomware, they're not gonna do this unless you give them access to the ransomware in the first place. And by saying you want the quote-unquote human firewall and all that other crap that we keep, you know, giving, like, making the users into some paragon of virtue. Have you met the users? They're not that bright for the most part. So anyway, you gotta keep these things in mind as we go. So first, how many people, and this is sad, how many people actually remember the Twitter hack from not this summer, but the summer before? You know, the whole devastating one where some criminal mastermind ended up going ahead and hacking into, you know, like President Obama's accounts, Joe Biden's accounts, all these accounts with tens of millions of followers and everything like that. And what happened was, it was called a highly sophisticated attack that was accomplished with highly sophisticated social engineering tactics. And Twitter came out and had this engineer write it all up about how everything was really sophisticated and they tricked their people and all that, but then they're going to give their users more awareness and they're going to stop everything. But when everybody started investigating that, what really happened? The quote-unquote criminal mastermind was a 17-year-old. Now, and this was literally the proverbial 17-year-old living in his basement. You do not have to be a mastermind for this. I think the kid was stupid enough to give interviews. That's not the sign of a mastermind. And what happens is, what did they actually do? It turns out that, yes, they just started going around finding Twitter employees on LinkedIn, randomly contacted them, Twitter allowed 20% of their users to actually have access to the administrative console. And when they had access, that's 1,000 people had the random ability to just change people's passwords with hundreds of millions of followers, with no multi-factor, well, at least they did have multi-factor authentication, but they didn't have any backup. And here's another thing that people forget. How many people remember that in 2018, this contractor, he left Twitter in 2018, and on his way out, he's just like, screw this, nobody else is doing it, I'm just gonna delete Donald Trump's account. And in 2018, this guy deleted Donald Trump's account. And in that case, what did they do? Did Twitter look at the whole issue and say, how do we prevent this from happening in the future? They're like, well, maybe we should have 2 or 3 people, verify Donald Trump's password changes and so on, and leaving everybody else vulnerable to a 17-year-old criminal mastermind. And by now, you should hopefully know I'm being very sarcastic at that. So, anyway, let's contrast this with Cloudflare. How many people remember when Cloudflare had a major issue? Nobody. This is the thing. We have all these wake-up calls that people hit the snooze button on. So anyway, Cloudflare had a major issue. Cloudflare is one of the biggest CDN, what is that, content delivery networks, CDN? So Cloudflare, they basically host lots and lots of websites and make sure that all these websites are available simultaneously around the world and everything like that. And what happened was there was a major outage at Cloudflare. And in this case, it wasn't some random engineer that got on Twitter and everywhere else and said, here's the update. Matt Prince, the CEO of Cloudflare, was the one delivering the messages. And to Matt Prince's credit, when I had to deal with the guy was actually a jerk. I didn't have to deal with him for this, but I still have to give the guy respect on this. The guy got on there and said what happened was some engineer entered the wrong information in a routing table, and that caused the outage. And somebody on Twitter replied back to him saying, I'd hate to be that engineer. And then Matt Prince, to his credit, basically replied back saying, it's not the fault of the engineer. It's a failure in leadership that one person was allowed to make a one-line error and cause a major outage of the entire internet, for lack of a better way of phrasing it. So what he did was, he essentially called that himself, he called that a failure in leadership. So that I give the guy credit for. So let me start talking about what I call old school safety science. And this is another thing. Old school safety science was basically, because in the cybersecurity world, we act like we're the first group of people that ever had to deal with human error. We act like for some reason all these other professions in the world somehow all their users are perfect, just when it comes to cybersecurity, do users have failings and everything. But safety science has been doing this, accounting's been doing this, I'm going to talk about a bunch of others in like a few slides in. But basically, old school safety science came up with, their attitude when they had to investigate an injury, they went ahead and said, why was that user stupid enough to get himself killed? That was how they used to go ahead and approach it. Because safety science is actually inside organizations, because if somebody injures themselves, for example, on a factory production line and they have to shut the production line down, that's a major outage to the organization. That costs millions of dollars. In cybersecurity, we suffer death by 1,000 cuts and really don't care. But all these other disciplines say, hey, wait a second, if there is a major loss, we're going to be able to calculate that and figure out what is an injury cost, how do we put in money to prevent it, and things like that. But again, old school safety science is, why was the user so stupid? They focus really on what's known as the proximity of the error. Specifically, what is going on with that user that caused this whole set of events. And basically everything was an analysis of why was the user wrong. And when you start thinking of that, when you look at airplane crashes, there's a difference between why did the pilot, aim their plane into the ground? That's the way they look at it. The pilots didn't aim their plane into the ground, but that's what I'll cover. But old school safety science was essentially saying, let's put gas masks on canaries. And, for those of you that don't know the analogy is that, they used to take canaries into mines and the canaries could die at a lower concentration of poisonous gas than people would. So if the canary dropped dead, then in that case, everybody should get out of the mine. Now, in cybersecurity, we have this attitude like, well, all we need are healthier canaries. If we have a healthier canary, we won't have any problems. We'll make the human firewall. But, again, keep this in mind. Operational problems, because here's the fundamental problems when we start looking at this. Proximity doesn't explain why something happens. A user clicking on ransomware, for example, does not explain essentially how the ransomware got on your network. Again, you have to give the users the shit to click on before they click on it. And nobody seems to be looking at that. The proximity doesn't really help on why that got there. Medical postmortems, I was talking to somebody yesterday, in the field, in medicine, if somebody dies in a hospital, they have weekly meetings or weekly tribunals, I guess you would call them more, and they basically make the doctor come up and describe the process of how the patient did, and all the other doctors sit around and say, well, why'd you do that? Why'd you do this? Why'd you do that? And when safety science people started looking at the medical profession, they started to realize something, and they started realizing, wait a second, that doctor, at the time they made a decision that cost the patient their lives, that was the right decision to make. But how did the doctor get into that position to make that decision? And when they started doing these detailed postmortems, they realized that 100 decisions back, the doctor went down this path that made that act inevitable. And so that's when they started looking. There's a whole system in place on how can we go ahead and make better decisions earlier in the process that could potentially save patients' lives. Now, moving on to New School of Safety Science, and I'm kind of adopting these principles, to computer cybersecurity at the moment, but basically, you have to look at the user as much a part of the system as the computer is. And people don't like to think of it that way. But basically, no matter how much you want to make the user into a paragon of virtue, the user is essentially just a single piece of the system that has to act and basically interact with the computer system and potentially cause damage. But they have to do their job. But what happens is when you apply the New School of Safety Science, if somebody injures themselves or if somebody clicks on ransomware, that's not a failure of the user, that's a failure of the whole system. If somebody injures themselves on a factory floor, again, you have to look at why was that person in that position? Why wasn't that person better protected? Why wasn't that person, when they started to injure themselves, why weren't there protections in place to stop the injury? Likewise, in cybersecurity, if a user clicks on ransomware and activates ransomware, that's a failure of your entire cybersecurity system, and that's how you have to approach it. The proximity of the action where the user clicks, because it's really easy to blame the user. Again though, the user cannot click on shit if the shit wasn't in the inbox. Even if a user clicks on shit, it doesn't mean the system has to allow the user unlimited privileges, that any user now has command of the computer to tell the operating system, encrypt the hard drive and every other hard drive in the entire network. That's a critical distinction that you have to understand, because this way, it doesn't just take the problem and put it on the user, because if you're expecting the firewall, the human firewall to succeed, well, tens of millions of dollars of computers have failed you, or tens of millions of dollars of software have failed you, there is something wrong. And how many people have seen that Dave cartoon? The one that's out of the New Yorker, where you have in this corner, they show a boxing ring, and they show in this corner, we have tens of millions of dollars of security software. In this corner, we have Dave, the stupid user. How many people have seen that? Or few, I hate you. But anyway, but the indication that I hate from that is that it's like, okay, this one person can ruin all the software. That's not what's going on. If one person can ruin your network really, really sucks. So you got to start looking inwardly and figure out, why is this proximity the cause of the whole problem and not the whole system that user, that one part of the system, interacts with? Because I don't know if I have a slide for this yet, but think of it this way. How many people have ever seen statistics for secure email gateways? Secure email gateways, besides of CoFence constantly, pointing out, proof point, let this one attack through. But basically, one message in 10,000 is getting through secure email gateways these days. On the other hand, the average user click rate, in the best of cases, according to the Verizon Data Breach Report, is 4% of the time a user will click on the message. So basically, 1 out of every 25 users will click on a phishing message. And now the thing is, even if you want awareness to come in, awareness might go ahead and address that 4%, maybe down to 3 or 3.5%. But your technology is still infinitely more effective of keeping that attack out of your company.
Just because the human firewall is going to fail 4% of the time on average, other technology is only failing 1 out of every 10,000. So keep that in mind as I go on. Okay, so a lot of people, many people wouldn't know, but I'm a master scuba diver trainer. And part of what I do, the first time I ever heard the expression, you can't, C-A-N-T, stop stupid, was when I was taking my instructor training. The course director basically, he's up there, he's like, you can't stop stupid. No matter what happens, one of your students is going to do something stupid. And I'm sitting here thinking, you know what? This whole course we're taking is about stopping stupid. Because how many of you are scuba divers? Okay, you're the only people I like in this room at this point. But anyway, so you have all these, when you look at scuba diving and scuba instruction, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but before you get in the water, you have to take like 100 hours of coursework, and that you go through and you get tested, and the coursework's basically telling you how not to kill yourself. And then once you know how not to kill yourself in theory, then you go into a scuba shop. The scuba shop says they re-give you the test just to make sure you didn't cheat online and make sure you pass. Then you go ahead, then they might put you in a pool, and when they put you in the pool, they don't give you scuba equipment. They basically make you get in the pool and kind of float for 10 minutes and swim do you think we really care whether or not the people can swim? That's what scuba equipment's for. You go underwater, you have air, we don't care. But really what it is to make sure you're not going to freak out in the water. That's all it is, that you're comfortable. And then before we put the student in there, we check their equipment, we show them how to check their equipment, and then all that happens. And then when we put them in the water, we put them in the shallow end where it's 4 feet, where all they have to do is stand up if anything happens. And then if we see it, they take them slowly to the deep end, and then do skills over a period of time. And then, only then do we take them in an open water area where this is clear, it's not going to be more than 30 feet deep, not more than 30 feet deep. And then when you're doing this, and besides that, before I go on, you have, there's insurance on these people before they go in open water. We know where all the hospitals are, we know how to call 911, we have medical kits, oxygen, etc. And even in this case, when I'm an instructor, I'm only allowed to take 8 people in, or 4 people if they're young. But 8 people, take them in the water, and I'm not going to trust 8 people because I have to work with 1 person at a time. So a smart instructor is going to go ahead, and if you look carefully, they bring a dive master or assistant instructor there, because you might have an idiot like I had in one of my classes that decided, hey, what does it look like underneath that platform, for example, where we specifically tell them not to go. But this is an example of where these things happen. And scuba, despite, there's an infinite number of ways to kill yourself in scuba diving. I've experienced at least one of them. But you can go ahead, and what happens is scuba diving is statistically safer than bowling. And that's actually a true fact. So anyway, when you start looking at this, where does the blame fall in safety science, and I'll use safety science for now, where does the blame actually fall when somebody injures themselves? 90% of the time when you do a post-mortem, you find that it's not the person making the mistake, it's the environment around the person. So for example, on a factory floor, you might find that like a forklift runs into a person. You might find, for example, that equipment falls on a person. You might find something going on where people bump into each other, pieces of equipment are too hot, equipment fails or something. Only 10% of the time is it a user action specifically that results in industry. Likewise in cybersecurity, I don't know about you, but I've done stupid things from the outside looking in, because if my computer is running slow and the cursor's lagging, and I click and the cursor looks like it's in one spot, but it's really in another, and I accidentally delete a message, or I accidentally click on a message I thought I was deleting or whatever, those things happen. But again, it's still 10% of the time. And just using an example, when I do awareness programs for companies, I usually try to meet with the safety manager. And I was walking around with a safety manager in their warehouse one day, and he was saying, he's like, you see these yellow lines here? These things are new. We just painted them about 2 months ago. Because what happened was we had a lot of people that were getting injured because forklifts would run into them or they'd walk into forklifts. And we decided what we're going to do was we did a whole bunch of studies, and we decided at the end of the day, just buy a bunch of paint, draw lines down, and say forklifts stay on one side, people stay on the other. And then finally what happened was number of injuries pretty much went down to 0. He's like, they think they had one because it was either the driver or the person walking were on their iPhones and they just were careless and walked in. But this is how these things really happen in the real world, how people injure themselves, how people basically create damage on computer systems. But at the end of the day, what's that 10%? The 10% is carelessness. You know, and here's the thing, awareness just impacts somebody who doesn't yet know better. Being careless doesn't necessarily help somebody who's, or is not somebody who doesn't yet know. It means they're just not paying attention. Blatant ignorance, maybe awareness can deal with that. A lack of training, yes, awareness, that's what it's for. It doesn't deal with malice, because when you look at the Verizon data breach report, statistically 28% of all insider, or 28% of all data breaches result from insider activities, and more awareness just helps the criminal be a better criminal at the end of the day. So you gotta start thinking that through. But anyway, this is where awareness might fit in, but it's still only 10% of the problem at the end of the day. Richard Marshall, a lot of you weren't here for that, so I'll just repeat this, but he spoke about my concept of, it's not my concept, it's something I adopted from counterterrorism, which is, boom. There's left of boom, boom, and right of boom. It's a terrorism term. Left of boom is what happens before there's an attack. Boom is at the point of the attack, what do you do? Right of boom is how do you start recovering, responding, and so on. So going into a little bit of detail on that, it's a counterterrorism strategy. And there's different disciplines within left of boom, boom, and right of boom. And you have different people working on both sides. So for example, if you're going to try to stop terrorism, you have some people who are out there essentially trying to do prevention, and those are people that might try to figure out who are the terrorists, how can we stop them, where they are before they get here, and so on. Then you have another set of people who are primarily interested in protection. Those people are there, for example, to harden buildings. They figure out where do we need blocks, let's put cement barriers up in front of buildings and so on, and they look at a different aspect. Then you have different people who look at boom, during the terrorist attack. That's where you get things, for example, like hardened cockpit doors. You get things like the, the baggage containers are bomb resistant, so that if they explode, they just kind of can suppress the blast and everything like that in a cargo hold inside planes and things to that effect. So that's where you're looking at the point of boom to stop it. But then, when you start doing response, there's a whole set of other disciplines. So the first part of response is, how do you go there? There's like studies done, how many hospitals do we need to be in place? How many police, where can we call in medical professionals and things like that? Simultaneously, you also have to train first responders, because these days, let's figure it out. If I'm saying shit, I might as well say, terrorists are fucking assholes. And, they have secondary explosions, just like what happened in Iraq a couple weeks ago at this point.
where they have the first explosion, and then they wait for responders to come in, and then they plan for the secondary explosion. And when you're training first responders, these first responders have to know, how can I get there to help people, but simultaneously try not to get lured in and be the second target? Because sometimes the second target is more valuable than the first. So you've got to start considering that. Then there might be poison gas, there might be chemical weapons and so on. Even if there's not, first responders still, if you see a person, here's a hint, if you see a person lying on the floor, you don't just run in and try to save them like you do in the movies. The first thing you should do is look around and see, is there gas? Maybe in some cases there's water on the floor with like an electrical outlet or something that could cause electrocution. So, and here's another lesson I learned in my scuba class. What's worse than a dead diver? Two dead divers, perfect. Even though you're not divers, you got the picture. Good for you. But then, getting people up and resilient and all that stuff. So anyway, let's talk about the concept in cybersecurity and ransomware and everything like that, and what I call user-initiated loss. Because at the end of the day, when we're talking ransomware, let me ask you this question. Does the user encrypt every bit on the computer? No. The user doesn't sit there and say, okay, I'm flipping this bit, I'm flipping that bit. The user clicks on a program, the program then has to download, install itself, and execute. The user's not causing the damage. The user might have taken an action that caused a sequence of events. So the user initiated that loss. Likewise, it doesn't just have to be just an accident. It doesn't have to be the user was tricked. It could be the user's malicious. It could be the user's well-meaning but decided he needed to do something, for example. And just to give you an example of something that is, people are like, why would anybody do something like this? There was a case in a large investment bank where somebody was working on, they're the type of thing, they were doing trade support, in other words, like traders who do commodities trades and things like that. They go ahead and they have to process the trades, and automating the settlement is kind of important. So somebody was working on the automation and they decided they needed to take some data home and work on it overnight because they were too busy during the day. And what happened was, in this case, luckily for the person deleted a bunch of fields that they didn't need for it and put it in an email and sent it to his home account. This is a large investment bank in New York, and those banks really have it locked down. So data leak prevention caught it, and once the data leak prevention caught it, the guy was called into the security office the next morning when he got in. And basically they were like, why did you do this? And he was in tears. They didn't fire him because he was, at least he could show he took away the sensitive data he didn't need. But it was still, the user did something for not even a good purpose in theory, but there was a potential loss there if it wasn't stopped. So here's the issue. When I look at loss, when I look at the user, I refer to it as user-initiated loss because I don't care why it happened when I was trying to respond to it initially. I don't care how it got, well, I do care, but I care how was the user put into that position, why did the user essentially, not why, but more how, and then how can it be prevented? But it's not the user needs more awareness, because that's not the answer for the most part. So let's talk about Rhino Boom and try to stop Boom being ransomware. You want to prevent the user from being in a position to initiate this ransomware loss. And how do you essentially do that? You go ahead and you start filtering it out. If you're doing things really proactively, I'm going to have a diagram. You're working with the anti-phishing working group, you're using DMARC, you have good email filters and so on. So you start filtering out the attacks before it gets to the user. I'm going to go through this in a little bit more detail, but anyway, every phase that led to Boom, you also have the concept of prevention, detection, and reaction there, because you can prevent the attacks. You should also detect when bad things are coming in, so you know to be more diligent and react to other attacks you might not be proactively seeing. So that's on the critical side of what to do. You can also create a security culture. How many people heard my NSA story where my coworker took my badge? Yeah. Okay, so a few people. How many didn't? Okay, you're going to be bored now. So anyway, so what happened was when I worked in NSA, I was working 24 hours, 24/7 shift work, and I was like at work like 3 in the morning, a report came in, we were using a mechanical plug plotter, and the plotter essentially had an arm that moved around, so I had to take my badge off to use the plotter. And then what happened was, I finished putting out the report, ran to the restroom. As I'm in the hallway, a guard stops and he's like, looks at me and goes, "Where's your badge?" I'm like, "I guess it's in my office." He's like, "We're going to your office." I go, "You're not allowed anywhere near my office." He's like, "I'll wait by the door." So anyway, then he's waiting by the door. I go over to the plotter and I can't find my badge. I'm looking under it, I'm looking around, I'm looking at my normal work desk. And my coworker all of a sudden is like, "Are you looking for something, Ira?" I'm like, "Where?" Sorry, I've already, broke the seal on this, but it's like, I'm like, "Where's my fucking badge, you asshole?" And he's like, "What badge? The one that should," I'm like, "Give me my fucking badge." And the guard is there a problem here? Do you think I ever forgot that badge again in my entire NSA career? No, I never did that, because the culture was reinforcing of wearing a badge, where if you didn't wear your badge, they went through hell. So anyway, and this is called, I guess the concept is shaming, or that's the technical name. Shaming, people say, "Oh, you don't want to shame the user." I'll tell you one thing. Shaming in an appropriate way is going to be the most effective awareness lesson you could ever give a person. So anyway, now let's talk about governance, because here's the thing. In cybersecurity, we look at governance as that annoying set of documents that we have to write, that you put on the shelf, and that you only show to the auditors before they, when they come once a year to look at your documents. Governance should detail specifically how you do your job. It should detail specifically how a user is supposed to do their job. So for example, if I'm trying to give a non-sensitive example, but let's say, I'll reflect a story somebody told me yesterday. Let's say you're sitting here and the user gets a document in from, it's a legal document that they got in, and the user says, "Oh, here's a settlement sheet, we need you to review this." And the user is like, "Oh, it's a settlement sheet, let me open this up and look at it." Really, the process should be, a settlement sheet's a legal document. They need to send that through the internal procedures so that the right legal department people get that and they review it. It should not be the job of a new person to look at a random legal document and figure out what to do with that document. So there should be a process that all legal documents go to, go to the legal department. How many people have ever worked with accounts payable departments? Because if you've done that, you probably know accounts payable fraud is a big problem. Not only is accounts payable fraud a big problem, it's also a primary phishing target, voice phishing, for ransomware delivery. Because what happens is, some bad guy will go ahead, they know accounts payable generally has to go ahead and look at, PDF and other documents and open them up. But what happens is most organizations now have an invoicing system, and the invoicing system has to receive it. That's why it says invoices at accounts payable at company.com, because that system filters out, not just enters it into the system, but filters out potentially malicious attacks. But what will happen is people will go ahead, call up accounts payable and say, "Hey, I have an invoice that's more than 60 days overdue. Can you look in the system?" And somebody will say, "Oh, we don't have you on the system." It's like, really, what's your email address? Because if I have your email address, I'll go ahead and email it to you right now while we're on the phone. And that's a common attack in accounts payable departments. So what happens is, you go ahead, email that in, and you open it up, and it's a malicious file, sets off ransomware. You don't want that. But if the users know, the first thing I'm supposed to do is, if somebody calls up and wants to email me an invoice, they have to send it to accounts payable, period. There is no thing. But if there's something out of the ordinary, I talk about when I was in the Marines, it was General Order number 9, I think it's 9. Call the corporal of the guards when a situation outside of instructions arises. Something like that. You don't give the user discretion. You say, if something's out of the ordinary, call the corporal of the guards. Something out of the ordinary, call your manager. You don't have the approval to start doing things. And that's okay. Anyway, but governance is key. Boom. What do you do when the user is presented with the opportunity to initiate a loss? Do they do it? Do they detect it, report it, and so on? There's a whole bunch of things. But remember, The user can initiate the loss by accident, because they were careless, malicious, willful, whatever the case is. It doesn't matter. When I'm a security professional, I don't care why a user did something that is potentially going to cause damage. I need to proactively know what is the capability. And here's the thing, you all know, and if you don't know, what is the if you don't know, you should find out. Because your users can only do things you give them the privileges to do. If you give them a computer, you're giving them access, you need to know what that access is, what they can do, and so on. And if you know that, you know what damage they can initiate. It's not like there's an infinite number of choices they have. They can only do what you have given them the privileges to do, whether you know you gave them the privileges or not. But anyway, it comes back to policies and governance. I'm sure all of you have kind of had to take awareness training, right? At some point. How many of you have ever come away with the feeling, it's like you're being afraid, you're being told there are bad people out there. And what happens is, when you look at this, you're basically what I call creating Elmer Fudd. If you don't know who Elmer Fudd is, I'm adding you to the list of people I hate. But Elmer Fudd, it should be, even the 14-year-old should know, they just had the new Space Jam come out. But Elmer Fudd was always on the lookout for the wascally wabbit. And if you ever watch Bugs Bunny, if Bugs Bunny put on a wig and a dress, Elmer Fudd couldn't recognize Bugs Bunny. Right? I'm not making that up. But that's your users. You're basically saying, a user gets an email saying, I'm the CEO, I need you to do something. And the user, we're training the user to say, is this the hacker I've been told about, or is this really the CEO? That's not the question they should be asking. What the question they should be asking is, this is asking for PII. What is the process for releasing PII to somebody else, even if it's the CEO or not? And the process for releasing PII is, I don't have the ability, the authorization to do that. I have to give it to my manager. So you're not there, because think about it this way. In general, when we're talking about ransomware and all these other sorts of things, we're essentially saying that you're dealing with nation states, you're dealing with sophisticated cyber gangs that know how to launder tens of millions of dollars and things like that. If your security program has, what's another phrase I hate? The user is your last line of defense. If your security program relies upon the user being your last line of defense against a highly skilled criminal and or sociopath, you have lost. Because that criminal / sociopath is going to eventually win at some point in time. You might get lucky, but the right way to do this, as opposed to telling people the 1,000 things to be afraid of, you should be telling people what is the right way to do their job properly. And if it involves downloading files, the answer is no. If it involves giving out sensitive information, the answer is no. Elevate this to somebody else, or so on. Oh, but I did know, so I should say that. I once had a user, and here's where you know CISOs that should be fired. I once had a user sent a message to their security department and said, this looks like it could be, ransomware or something. And the CISO looked at it and said, and basically said, yeah, somebody sent this to me. Can you open it up and check it out? And literally, they set off, the CISO caused the ransomware to be set off. Anyway, I won't name that company, but they're a big target. So anyway, you got Write-A-Boom. Under Write-A-Boom, at some point the loss has been initiated. I don't care why the loss has been initiated, but there has been a set of events that is causing a potential loss to potentially be initiated. Now, does the environment expect it? Again, you should expect the user to potentially do something. You know the capabilities of an individual user. You should be looking for that. Do you have protections for, can a user potentially download a file? If they can, then you set off protections and say, okay, we're going to sandbox it. We're going to put DLP. We're going to put anti-malware. We're going to do a whole bunch of stuff. But you look at what the user can do and start layering protections in that way. So anyway, can everybody see that clearly? I don't know how it looks from your side. So here's very good. I'm happy with this. So anyway, let's look at stepping through, and I don't know if can you see my cursor move around here?
No.
Okay, and I don't have a laser pointer either, so I'm going to talk through this. So when you start out at point zero, how does ransomware get on a system? Ransomware, some malicious actor has to go ahead, they have to have a botnet or something like that to send messages around the internet or so on. There's another one of potentially doing like watering hole attacks and malicious, creating malicious websites, but let's just focus on the phishing aspect because this is where most of it tends to come from. So basically, the malicious person is on the internet, they work the botnets send it out. If you're working with the anti-phishing working group, potentially you could start blacklisting them. Then it gets to perimeter devices. If you're looking at the perimeter devices, if you have DMARC, for example, enabled on those systems, you should potentially be able to filter those out. Then once it gets through your perimeter, then you have your mail server. Your mail server should have anti-phishing, it should have anti-malware, should be looking for attachments and a whole bunch of other things. Then from that point, then it gets to the email client. Most email clients, there's usually there's the anti-malware that's on the email client. There's also anti-phishing that's on the email client. And so what happens is you have a user interface at this point. I'm going to have a more detailed graphic of how to logically address the layers in a second. But now we're at the user experience. And the user is essentially now looking either at their inbox or their spam folder. At that point, the user then has to make a decision on how they go ahead and interact with this. Now, when they make the decision, this is where awareness can potentially come in. But awareness should be driven by policy, which says, we need to have, awareness training. The awareness training should focus on how to do the jobs right. The procedures should define how do they evaluate email messages correctly, not to be afraid of that big, bad, tricky hacker. And then once they have that, then they have the awareness is imparted on the user on how to do their job properly, not what to be afraid of in the ideal world. Then you also have the concept of nudges. What nudges are those are little inklings of behavior triggers. So for example, a nudge, I'm sure most of you have seen this message originated from outside the company. That's an example of a nudge. Some more advanced email filters tend to have this is a first-time sender, this is this is coming from an unknown source and so on. This doesn't look like it's coming from the right place, so you can go ahead and have all those nudges embedded to help the user make the right decision. And just for the sake of argument, I also have the user going to social media, because social media, for example, like your LinkedIn profile, helps criminals target them. So maybe giving people the right guidance on how to use social media can help out as well. But anyway, let's say the user decides to potentially click on a ransomware message. Then you go back into the user experience. The user experience then goes ahead and says, wait a second. This doesn't look like the right thing you should be doing. And then the user says, you know what, I still want to do that. And then
this presentation, really, your job is not giving canaries gas masks. Your job is not creating the human firewall. Your job is saying, we have a problem. The problem with canaries is not that canaries die. The problem with canaries is that there's a leak, there's poisonous gas in the entire system, and the canary is just the symptom of the entire failed system. That's your users. Giving users a gas mask and saying, we are making the human firewall, does absolutely nothing in allowing the attack, because again, if you're relying upon the human firewall, that fails 4% of the time, which in any strategy whatsoever is horrible. You have failed as a security professional. Anyway. Oh, but if you really get nothing out of the presentation, bye-bye. Anyway, any questions? Okay, John will give out prizes and everything. Have a lovely day. Bye.